Hello Internet, I'm John Brill, and this is For Liberty. Accountability. We want to hold our politicians accountable, both for what they do and what they don't do, as the case may be. But how are we to hold them accountable? We can unelect them, yes, but you might have noticed that a lot of politicians are really hard to unelect. Heck, it is extraordinarily difficult to find people willing to challenge the incumbent, let alone mount a successful campaign. So hard are incumbents to unelect that, in most situations, they are functionally unaccountable to the people they are supposed to represent. What then is accountability? Accountability is a measure of how easy it is for a challenger to unseat a sitting incumbent. The easier it is for a challenger to unseat a sitting incumbent, the more accountable that incumbent is. Conversely, the harder it is to unseat a sitting incumbent, the less accountable he is. But what makes challenging an incumbent more or less difficult? It is easy to say, special interests, the two-party system, that you gotta be corrupt to get into office, or what have you. But those things are not the root of why any given incumbent is more or less vulnerable to being unseated. And there is a deeper reason, and it is the size of the constituency. The smaller the size of the constituency, the less time, energy, and resources that are needed to run a winning campaign. The larger the constituency, the more time, energy, and resources a challenger will need to collect and expend in order to mount a competitive campaign. Let us examine 3 scenarios to illustrate the increasing organizational hurdles that accompany larger constituencies. Say you have a town council, where the total population in the district is 5,000 people. What is really needed to win an election in such a district? The candidate could mount a one-man campaign, knock on the door of every voter, ask for their vote personally, and he can win the election. He would just need to print up some palm cards and a few yard signs, put in the effort, and boom, a one-man campaign. But examining that closer, the knocking on the door of every voter, what does that entail? That 5,000 people isn't going to be 5,000 houses, so we aren't even talking about 5,000 doors to knock on. Most people live with someone else, and maybe 25% of the population is 18 or under. So in a district with 5,000 people might actually work out to be closer to 2,000 households whose doors need to be knocked on. Think about the logistics of this. If it is a November election and our candidate is walking every weekend for the 8 months prior to the election, or 32 weeks, with about 2,000 doors to knock on, then he would need to knock on about 63 doors a week to get to the household of every single constituent. That might take about 6 hours of knocking on doors each weekend. The candidate does not need a campaign manager. He doesn't need to do media buys. He doesn't need to have a campaign office. He can do all the work of the campaign, reaching the voters, by himself. He does not even need anyone to donate money, as some palm cards and a small run of yard signs do not cost very much. Such is the beauty of a one-man campaign. But say you have a district of 20,000 people. If our candidate wanted to knock on the door of every potential voter, that might work out to be about 8,000 doors that need to be knocked on. If our candidate is knocking on doors every week for 8 months, then he would need to knock on an average of 250 doors a week in order to knock on the door of every single potential voter in the course of one campaign. Try knocking on 250 doors a week, and at the same time work your full-time job that pays all the bills and spend time with your family. That's going to be a lot of 60-hour weeks. But if the candidate can be a full-time candidate, if he can somehow skate by for a year neglecting his personal finances, then in a district of 20,000 people, he could still mount a one-man campaign and potentially shake the hand of every voter in his district. But that would mean sacrificing time with his family and sacrificing that which pays the bills. Very difficult, but if you have spent a few years preparing yourself, then it can be done. But say you have a district of 80,000 people. That might work out to be about 32,000 doors. That would be roughly 1,000 doors the candidate would need to knock on each week for 32 weeks in order to potentially shake the hand of every single constituent. There is just no way that a candidate can do that. That'd be about 143 doors a day, every day, for the 8 months prior to the November election. But actually shaking the hand of every single constituent is, strictly speaking, unnecessary to win the election. In my home state of Virginia, a House of Delegates seat has about 80,000 constituents, and seats are generally won with between 10 and 20,000 votes. A successful former member of the Virginia House of Delegates was often quoted in my area as saying that if a candidate personally knocked on 15,000 doors, then he had his race won. Why is this? Because the candidate does not need to knock on the doors of people who are not registered to vote, or who are not likely to vote in that particular election. And he doesn't need to knock on the doors of people who are likely to vote for an opposing party. What does that look like number-wise? Of that 80,000 people, it might be closer to 50,000 that are actually registered to vote. Of that 50,000, there might be 25,000 that will only vote in a presidential election, not in a House of Delegates race. Of the remaining 25,000, let's say that 2 out of every 5 voters is guaranteed to vote for their opponent based upon political affiliation. So that means your target voter pool in a district of 80,000 people might really be about 15,000 people. By focusing on those people who, based upon their past voting history, are likely to vote in the election and who are either likely to vote for him or likely undecided, then our challenger can still technically mount a one-man campaign. But knocking on 15,000 doors is still very hard. If the challenger intends to knock on 15,000 doors, then he should start as soon as the weather is warm enough to go door to door. That leaves 8 months to knock on 15,000 doors. Our challenger will need to knock on 1,875 doors per month in order to hit that target for an average of about 67 doors per day. Our challenger won't be able to knock on the door of every voter, but he'll be able to knock on enough doors that he can win if he has arranged his life so that he can afford to spend 5 hours or so walking every single day in order to reach the 15,000 doors by the time the election rolls around. That's a lot of work. Our challenger will need to be physically fit to do all of that. He will need to be able to allocate the time for those knocks in addition to his day job and tending to his family. It's doable, but to maximize our chances of unseating the incumbent, our challenger would have been wise to situate his personal life so that such is possible, and it can take years or decades to do that. The greater his lead time for preparation, the better he will be able to perform. So while it is technically possible to unseat a sitting incumbent in a district of 80,000 people with a one-man campaign in a general election, it is very, very hard to do, and I've not heard of it actually being done. Having staff, volunteers, and a strong coalition helps greatly. The challenger will need money for advertising, mailers, door hangers, palm cards, signs, and a campaign office. He'll need the time, effort, and talents of many people to carry him over the finish line. Even with those resources, our candidate will still need to focus on those 15,000 people and ignore the other 65,000. Not out of malice, but simply because reaching those 15,000 doors is such a massive task in and of itself. This is the kind of incentive that large districts create, and we have to ask ourselves, do we really want those incentives shaping our office holder? For most people, these are organizational hurdles that they are not at all equipped to overcome. The tyranny of district size prevents a lot of people from being able to run for office because they do not have the time or resources to devote to it. The very size of the district makes it prohibitive for anyone willing to run from being able to make the attempt in the first place. This is the principal reason why it is so difficult to recruit able candidates for any number of offices. Naturally, the larger the district, the larger the organizational challenges there are to successfully unseating an incumbent simply because it is harder to reach that greater number of people. And unfortunately, there are a lot of local, state, and federal seats that are way above 80,000 people. We have a lot of problems with our representative form of government, and people will point to a lot of different things as causing or contributing to those problems. But a lot of these problems with our elected officials seems to stem from the very bigness of their districts. If these districts are so large and that very bigness makes it difficult to hold our elected officials accountable, then what can be done to make it easier for challengers to unseat incumbents and thus increase accountability in our form of government? The answer? Make districts smaller. Making districts smaller increases the degree to which elected officials can be held accountable by reducing the organizational hurdles of challenging incumbents. Making districts smaller can be done in several ways, and there are multiple factors to consider in doing so. Some of those factors depend upon whether it is a local, state, or federal office we are talking about. I want to talk about each of those in turn, and I'm going to start with the local level first. Join me next time as we discuss accountability on the local level. Thank you for watching, and if you like this, then click here to see more for Liberty.